start booing, she's a lawyer on the right side who specialises in planetary rights. And you might not have heard of this concept. She's going to explain what it is. But it could be one of the ways through. And I hope that she's going to help us get some way towards answering question 3. What would a good climate agreement look like? And in the context, in this case, of an agreement which is not just legally binding upon the nation states, but gives them a specific set of legal rights and duties towards the planet, and if they don't adhere to those, they could be sued. This perhaps would be what might concentrate governments' minds. So Polly, over to you.
Thank you very much everyone for coming. As we all know, climate change negotiations at the moment are collapsing. What do we do? Well, I found it very interesting this week. I was here last week and noticed that, in fact, although the people are here in Climate Forum, just a mile and a half down the road from the Bella Centre, actually, metaphorically, we are 1,000 miles apart. Bolivia last week offered that if anyone from Climate Forum was interested, they would take proposals that we, the people, could put into the climate negotiations as part of the drafting for the Copenhagen Treaty, and that they would actually propose it into the COP negotiations. It remains to be seen whether or not that happens. I was actually involved with that on Friday, and there were a group of us who ended up drafting for 9 hours. I was the only lawyer involved, and in fact we all came from very diverse backgrounds. Indigenous, one was an accountant, one was a scientist, an activist, a musician, so there was a really wide remit. But what was very interesting was that there was a collective convergence on what we believed should happen. And what was truly remarkable was that by the end of 9 hours, we came up with an incredibly ambitious document that came up with proposals that after 15 years of negotiations, our governments haven't even looked at. And the starting point really was that trading has to stop. We also realised that we had to identify pollution at point source and that this wasn't happening. And this really ties in with a couple of slides I'd like to show you just quickly while we're waiting for the others to turn up. Let's see if we can pull them up. Yes. If I can just twist through this. What we realised was that we have two very different approaches that are being taken in the approach to addressing climate change. You'll see here on the screen that one I have named old paradigm, one new paradigm. What's happening in the Bella Centre is very much premised on the old paradigm. The idea, the concept that the planet itself is an inert being, an inert thing. And if you see the planet as an inert thing, then what you do is you impose a value on it. You commoditize it in essence. Therefore, you can create trade mechanisms. You create a commodity. This is a real problem because actually, who benefits at the end of the day? Does the planet benefit? Ultimately, no. Only business benefits from that. Whereas if you change your paradigm and start looking at the planet as a living being, then you're looking at the intrinsic value, and therefore you can start taking responsibilities. Actually, this is not so easy to read, but if you can see that, you'll notice that if we take that side where the old paradigm, where we're essentially commoditizing the planet, then what happens is that we create permits to pollute. We create mechanisms to allow the continuance to happen. That we actually have fossil fuel subsidies still in place. We have trade mechanisms, and really at the end of the day you end up with unaccountable hidden mechanisms. If we were to move into that new paradigm, then we can transition very, very fast. And this is about creating legislation to stop pollution. This is about financing into that transition. That's about withdrawing the fossil fuel subsidies. That's about implementing huge subsidies for clean solutions. It's also about looking at governments at community level, not just national and international level. And you then end up with far more accountable implementation of rules and legislation. But most importantly, we have lessons to learn from 200 years ago. And I'd like to just quickly run through this with you because I think this is very important. We had something that happened there 200 years ago, and we have lessons that we can take from there and we can use today. And I would very much like our politicians to understand this as well. Basically, what we had then was a problem with human slavery. And of course, humans were a form of energy. And we replaced human slavery with now what we have is planetary slavery. So we replaced one energy with another energy. It was human, now for fossil fuel. And what we've discovered is that 300 corporations exist today that are trading in fossil fuel and heavy extractive industries, and that accounts for 78% of the excess greenhouse gases. Now, this is about identifying pollution at point of source. And if we compare 200 years ago, where we had a situation where we had 300 companies who were trading in slaves, Wilberforce came along in the UK and carried the mantle of abolishing slavery. And he managed to do that in his lifetime. In fact, the legislation was passed just 3 days before he died. But he had three main issues that he said had to be addressed. First of all, you have to pool the subsidies. Slavery was heavily subsidized. Secondly, you have to make that which is damaging illegal. And thirdly, you give subsidies to create the new markets. And indeed, when it was rendered illegal, those companies that were trading in slavery, within a year they were trading in tea in China. So they reinvented their wheels very, very fast. And in fact, industry works very well with legislation because it closes it in, it gives it a good sense of what it needs to do and what it can't do, and it also gives them an opportunity to argue for lots of money to reinvent their wheels. The industry at that time, however, argued very much against the abolition. And that's what they said. To stop would be uneconomic. It would lead to loss of jobs. Public demand that it remain. And industry ultimately said it was a necessity, that it must continue. What they proposed was in effect a cap and trade mechanism. Leave it to the market and we'll limit the numbers. That they would self-regulate. That in fact they'd improve conditions, give better bedding. And that why not give us permits? We will limit the amount that we trade, and if we trade less, then we can trade them. And if not, we can pay fines if we exceed. The differences between then and now are astounding, as this next slide shows. The only thing that's changed is the picture. And instead of 300 companies, it's 300 corporations. Same arguments are being put, same proposals have been put. But however, 200 years ago, they said no to those proposals. Today, we have implemented them. It's very important that we try and shift our paradigm here. And what I have seen with the Copenhagen Treaty, or certainly the version that I was working on last week, was quite an astounding document. I inputted into my computer to see how many times the word responsibility was used in that document. It's actually used 5 times to identify common but differentiated responsibility. I looked to see how many times duty was put into that document. None. Obligation. None. We have one piece of legislation that is really pivotal that protects our planet, and that's the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. When I put into that document those words, for obligations, for instance, I got it used 71 times. It identifies our duties. It identifies our responsibilities. I suggest that we actually have to get rid of a word, and that word is sustainability, and we replace it with responsibility. When we do that, we start to identify our duties and our obligations, and that's to us as well as to the planet. And one of the ways that we can do that is also by implementing wider rights. Human rights were born 60 years ago as a result of the humanitarian crisis of the Second World War. We now have a planetary crisis. We need the laws to protect the planet. We do have the legal mechanisms protect the planet. Our environmental laws for the last 40 years have been premised on trade mechanisms. Ultimately, the only ones that benefit from it are business. Through agencies, the permits to pollute, the permits to allow damage to continue. That is the type of legislation that we have used internationally. That is what the international COP negotiations are basing their remit on. We could use what's called public trust doctrine laws. Now, they've been in existence since the 13th century, and now we use them internationally. And it's very simple. We can set up a trust for the planet. And from that trust, we have trustees. And what we do is we shift from a position of ownership of the planet, where we divvy it up and then we start trading it and we privatize it, to a position of stewardship, where what we do with the trust, instead of the trust being a big pot of money, we protect our capital asset and we restore that which is damaging. And instead of taking from the capital, we take from the growth and the interest. Now, a trust is very easy to understand. We have in the UK what's commonly derided as trust fund babes. Some people are laughing. Where you have essentially a wealthy child is granted money from a wealthy uncle, say, who puts a lump sum into a pot and has a set of trustees to look after that pot of money, and the child then receives a dividend. It's the interest that accrues out of it. The trustees have a stewardship role to ensure that that pot remains intact, and if anything comes out of it, then they restore it. I'm proposing that we need to do the same for the planet. In fact, we have community land trusts in the UK to protect patches of the planet. We can do this writ large. And what I have done is I have set up, just yesterday, exactly that, a Planet Earth Trust. And that we, as members of the planet, can become trustees of it. And if enough of us come on board and become trustees to protect the capital asset for the beneficiaries, and who are the beneficiaries? Well, that's all beings. That is the larger Earth community. That is the soils, the seas, the trees, and even the humble bumblebee. Because of course we have colony collapse disorder staring at us in the face. If we lose our bees, we lose 70% of our foodstuffs overnight. So we need to shift away from commoditizing the planet to actually a position of trust and a law that is recognized internationally. We can do that, and I'm asking you to stand with me and recognize that. And that's about recognizing the inherent natural laws of the planet. This is something that the indigenous people understand very well, as do Buddhists, and as do many spiritual people. The right not to be polluted, the right to restorative justice, the freedom of a clean and healthy environment, the right to ecological integrity, the right to diversity, the freedom of the natural cycles of life. Those ultimately are natural rights. They can be implemented into hard law, into legislation. Bolivia is wanting to run with the Universal Declaration of Mother Nature's rights. It's the same thing. I ask you to support them. This is a voice coming from the indigenous world, and we in the Western world need to stand up and support that. We need to move, really shift our paradigm away from restrictive legislation that just protects corporate interests to legislation that protects us as well as the planet. Thank you very much for listening.